After the trial, the judge gave us the opportunity to speak to the jury. And I remember walking back, and obviously there was a lot of emotion in the courtroom. There were smiles, there were tears, people were excited, people were upset. I mean, just the full panoply of emotions in the courtroom. We walked back through a narrow corridor, and the logistics were not great. The jury was trying to come out of the jury deliberation room as the lawyers were walking back to talk to them. And, there were 19 lawyers involved in the case, both plaintiffs and defense. I sort of locked eyes with a juror who was an immigrant from the Ukraine. And of course, I didn't have the opportunity to speak to her during the trial, but she sort of locked eyes with me and looked at me, and I could see that she had some tears in her eyes, and I walked up to her, and I said hello, and she said, "Hello, Mr. Wigrizer." And I said, "What do you think?" She said, "I want you to know, Mr. Wigrizer, that what happened here could never have happened in my country. An ordinary person would not have the opportunity to go into a courtroom and have a case heard against rich people and corporations and businesses. That cannot happen." And she said, "It would be impossible to have a case in a courtroom where other ordinary people are judging these rich people and these corporations. This jury experience, it would be impossible to happen." She said to me, I can't even say it.
No, go ahead.
I am so proud to be an American. And, I have been preaching about the virtues of our jury system for years and years and years. And I thought that I understood the importance of our system, but never in my life did I understand it the way I did that moment, that day, in talking to that juror. And we just hugged. And it really brought home for me the importance of, it brought home a number of things. The importance of our system and how fortunate we are to have the freedoms that we have in this country. And I was proud of my profession. I was proud to be a Philadelphian that day, and I was very, very proud to be an American.
On Wednesday, June 5th, 2013, at 10:43, on a Wednesday morning, the Salvation Army building at 2140 Market Street collapsed. 7 people were killed, 13 were injured. Our guest today on the Faces of the Main Line is plaintiff's attorney Stephen Wigrizer. Stephen, welcome.
Pleasure to be here, John. Yes.
Thank you very much for coming on.
My pleasure.
Sometimes as a private citizen, I'll see something in the newspaper that really jumps out at me. And I'm not an attorney, and I'll say, boy, I would really like to represent that case. Is that what happened to you when you saw what happened there, and your heart must have gone out to the victims?
Absolutely. Certainly. When I see a disaster of that magnitude, knowing that I can be of assistance, knowing that I can add value to the case, of course I want to be involved. And a case like this affects all Philadelphians, all residents of the Delaware Valley, because it calls into question our safety when we walk into a store, when we walk into a business. We have certain expectations of our business owners that the businesses and the buildings will be safe for us to enter and do our shopping. And so this particular case strikes a resonant chord with many of us, and it certainly did with me. And of course, on top of that, one of the clients who I was asked to represent was an individual who died at the age of 24. I have a 24-year-old daughter. We can all envision our children walking into a store, whether it be a thrift shop or any retail store, to purchase clothing, in this case to make donations and to purchase clothing. And so that's another area where it struck a chord in all of us. So it is very much a personal thing. And yes, when I saw what happened, I very much wanted to get involved.
When you saw that, did you say to yourself, how the hell did that happen? How did this building just fall down? That's what I said to myself.
I've been doing this for 38 years, and I've been involved in a lot of structural failures, and I've been involved in other building collapses. So, there are only so many reasons why structures collapse. And in this case, it was a building, actually the building next door to the Salvation Army, which collapsed onto the Salvation Army building. And that particular building, we called it the Hoagie City building because of the sign on the front. That building was under demolition. Unfortunately, the demolition was inappropriate. It was not being done in a proper manner. And one of the major problems, and I'm just picking some of the highlights here, was that a freestanding, unsupported wall was left on the western side of that building, looming over the Salvation Army building. And it was almost inevitable that this disaster would occur. And of course, what made the disaster even more predictable here was the fact that the owner of the Hoagie City building hired incompetent personnel, including an incompetent demolition contractor, to staff the demolition.
Would that have been Richie Bassiano?
Yes, Richard Bassiano was the owner of the property through a corporation which he controlled, STB Investments Corporation. And the evidence was very clear. The jury quickly realized, and in their verdict announced, that he was grossly negligent.
Grossly negligent.
Grossly negligent and engaged in reckless and outrageous conduct in hiring an inexperienced and incompetent demolition contractor. And the evidence supported our position that he did so to save money.
And you point that out, and it's something that we'll get to later. But what does it take to assemble a team to, because you got to recreate the whole thing. It's not like a murder or other types of cases. It is a murder in one way. I know by the smile. I can tell by the smile on your face that it is a murder. But what kind of do you have to assemble a team to get to the root of this?
Well, I'd say yes and no. If you have to assemble a team on June 6th, 2013, then you're really not in a position to handle a case like this.
Okay.
So you have to have an existing infrastructure, as I am fortunate to have in my firm, so that we can easily become involved in this kind of case. And I'm talking about a quality staff. I have a terrific secretary and paralegal. We have information technology people. I have terrific associate attorneys working with me. Because you have to understand, in order to properly investigate a case like this, you're talking about reviewing almost 1 million documents that have to be scanned, uploaded, and accessible. And if you don't have that infrastructure in place, you'd better refer that case to an attorney who does. But after the case comes in, we have a network of experts who help us to evaluate these cases. So I was in a position to pick up the phone and call a structural engineer. I could call a demolition contractor. I can call a construction engineer. I needed to consult with a property management expert so that I could evaluate the conduct of the property owner. And we needed to hire a retail expert to talk about the obligations of the Salvation Army and whether or not they fulfilled those obligations to their customers and their employees that day. So really, it's a mixed bag. You have to be prepared in advance to handle this type of case, but you then have to know where to turn for experts who can help you evaluate and ultimately try the case.
I want to ask you about if there was a smoking gun on this, or was there a paper trail of this building being in question. But the first thing I want to ask you, it just came into my head, was how many hours a day did you work on this case?
Well, that's a very good question. For the ramp up time to trial, I would have to say I worked 20 hours a week on this case, maybe more, depending upon what was going on that week, where there were multiple depositions, which is where we question potential witnesses under oath. I devoted at least 40 hours a week. Of course, during trial, I devote every waking moment to my cases. I live, I sleep, I breathe the case. And when I say every waking hour, most of the hours are about waking hours. I sleep about 4 hours a night during trial, and I did that for 5.5 months in this case. So there is a tremendous expenditure of personal energy in order to bring this to a good conclusion. You know, you might think about an athlete, beginning a big game, or I make an analogy to the military. When we go to trial, we're going to war, and the courtroom is my battlefield.
You did say that to me.
Yes, and I'm a warrior, and that's what my clients need. That's what they expect. I'm a thoughtful warrior. I don't just go out there and bludgeon people, but that's what a client needs and expects from an attorney in the courtroom. And when you are involved in the heat of battle, you don't eat, you sleep very little, and you find an energy that, and I told you this earlier, ultimately I find very energizing.
I was going to say it's a turn-on. There's a little bit of a turn-on.
It is the ultimate turn-on for an attorney to have the opportunity to present a case of this magnitude with the media in the courtroom every day in a high-stakes situation. I mean, there are families that depend upon me for their future livelihood. When the breadwinner in a family is seriously injured or killed, it's my obligation to ensure the financial well-being of that family in perpetuity. So I find the entire process energizing, but I think I answered your question.
No, you answered with a lot of verve. You certainly were energized.
Yes.
And I want to go, was there a trail? Were there indicators that said, there's a problem here and it's being ignored?
Yeah, there were a number of, as you said earlier, smoking guns. Primarily, I think the biggest trail was a series of emails from the owner of the building, actually his property manager, to the Salvation Army, that went not to the folks working in the Salvation Army store, but went to the upper command of the Salvation Army in West Nyack, New York. And the trail of emails warned the Salvation Army of potential danger. It warned of potential loss of life and limb. And it even warned about the danger of an uncontrolled collapse. Wow. Every single one of those warnings turned out to be prophetic, turned out to be absolutely true. And of course, as the testimony came out, the Salvation Army upper command ignored those warnings. They didn't take a single step to investigate. They never sent out a demolition expert. They never sent out a structural engineer. They took the position that even though their building was attached to this building and directly within the zone of danger, that it was their demolition, it was their problem. And they even made the decision, a conscious decision, not to warn the good men and women who both worked in the store and who shopped in that store. And
they made a conscious decision.
Conscious decision. They didn't need to know, was the testimony. And I get upset about it when I think about it, because if that Salvation Army store had been closed that day, regardless of what was going on next door, 7 people would be alive today. 12 people would have been spared injuries, in some cases very serious injuries, and this was entirely preventable.
You mentioned your clients earlier. You said
Sure.
2 clients. They had diverse backgrounds, didn't they?
Sure they did. One of my clients is a family who live in Haverford.
Which is the Philadelphia main line, just for a viewing
yes,
audience.
which is the Philadelphia main line. And they lost a 24-year-old young woman who had her whole life ahead of her.
And as you said, your daughter's age.
I have a daughter who's 24. This particular individual was a rising star as an audio engineer. She loved music. She was destined to be very, very successful. She had a loving family, and it was a tragedy. My other client was a family of a 52-year-old immigrant from Sierra Leone, which is in West Africa.
West Africa, yeah.
And you may recall the movie Blood Diamonds.
Yes.
She survived what was one of the most brutal civil wars on the face of our planet. Found a way to bring herself and her family to the United States so that they could participate in the American dream, but most importantly, so that they could have security and safety. And it's tragically ironic that she came to the United States looking for safety, and she was in the Salvation Army on a day when neither the Salvation Army nor the owners of the building next door seemed to me or the jury to be particularly concerned about safety. And she lost her life, as did my 24-year-old client. So 2 very diverse people from different backgrounds, different experiences, unfortunately united, or at least united posthumously in this tragic
And came to you to represent them as your attorney, which is significant for you.
Well, yeah, I mean, I have a very diverse client base. It's kind of an interesting story here because, we live in the internet age, and information about everybody is accessible on the internet. Both families wanted to choose a lawyer in an informed way. Both went to the web, and I don't know the search parameter that they used, perhaps building collapse, but they found a case that I tried back in 1999 in which a part of a building, the parapet wall, the area around the roof, collapsed when Judge Beryl Caesar, who was a sitting Philadelphia judge, that family came to me to represent them. And I think they thought, well, if a Philadelphia judge is asking Steve Wigrizer to represent their family, then that's somebody they wanted to talk to. So we were fortunate enough to be engaged to represent them.
Just as a side note, I've never heard anybody bring this up, so maybe I'm the first person to say it. I remember your dad when he worked for SEPTA, and I worked for SEPTA.
Right.
And I thought it was ironic, and I remember when your dad was Leon Wigrizer was the Inspector General there. I thought it was ironic that, and I'm saying, this is me saying this, that a key piece of evidence in this case came off of a SEPTA bus, which was a video that was taken as a bus was passing. And I have seen that video many times because I still work as a subcontractor for SEPTA. I saw your name, I remembered your dad, I remembered the film, I said, wow, how ironic. But that's just me saying that.
No, absolutely. There were other tie-ins as well. I mean, my father was, he's no longer a practicing attorney, but he was in public service his entire life. And in addition to being SEPTA's IG, he was the Treasury Department's IG, and also for a brief period of time, he was commissioner of the Department of Licenses and Inspections. So
another irony.
Another irony here, because the conduct of the department was called into question at various points during the trial. Ultimately, the jury agreed with me that we cannot, as citizens, always expect government to protect us from ourselves, and that the primary responsibility here rests with those who own the buildings, who are asking customers to come in and shop within their buildings, and who plan and execute projects that carry with it the potential for harm and injury to the public.
Let me ask you about the Salvation Army again,
Sure.
because you brought it up, and you referenced the chain of command kind of a thing.
Right.
I interview lots of people, and people tell me, like yourself, tell me lots of things. Is that a kind of like a cultish mentality that the Salvation Army, or am I putting you on the spot?
Well, no, I'm happy to be put on the spot.
Okay, all right.
Yeah, the Salvation Army, and by the way, I just want to say that they do tremendous work for people who are at risk and in need, and I don't in any way call into question what they do as a charity, but in this case, we learned that they are run in a quasi-military fashion.
Mm-hmm.
Their officers have a rank, a colonel, general, captain, etc., and they wear uniforms, and they are primarily located in a command center. And the problem is that they communicate amongst themselves. But in the Northeast alone, they have 280 retail outlets. They are a bigger operation nationally than Nike.
Really?
They are a $13 billion corporation.
Were you stunned when that came to light to you?
I was very surprised. They have real estate holdings of $5 to $8 billion, right? So again,
Wow.
I don't call into question what they do. But it's interesting because at the end of the day, the jury didn't focus so much on their wealth or the number of retail outlets that they had. They are a charity and they are a religion as well. The Salvation Army is a church. And their mission is to do the most good. And in talking to the jurors, they were particularly upset that they did not live up to their mission. So they raised the bar because they are a charity and a church, but they failed miserably in their obligation, and they failed in their mission in this case. So the jury was even more upset, and that informs what they did. They found the Salvation Army to be 75% responsible for this disaster.
75%.
75% responsible.
Is that like you said? You're a thoughtful warrior.
Yeah.
Is this, do you, as the pieces start to come together, do you start to say, okay, this is the area that we need to attack? It's not necessarily Richie Bassiano. And I wanted to ask you about Plato Marinokis.
Sure.
Because he got some kind of a deal. And so when you say to yourself, okay, it's really, the bottom line is it's the Salvation Army. Is that how you looked at this?
Well, I want to use perhaps a football game as an analogy. You go in.
Football's a great analogy.
Okay, you go in with a game plan, but sometimes you have to audible at the line of scrimmage. So, I'm there in that courtroom for 5.5 months, and I listen to the witnesses, and I assess their credibility. And during the course of the trial, I don't want to say there was any kind of sea change in our focus. We had always concluded, and we tried this case, by the way, to a mock jury, which is a very interesting topic. We pre-tried this case using a psychologist, using 24 individuals who would likely be the type of individuals in our juror pool, and we derived a lot of information about how a jury might view our case. But certainly during the course of the trial, we were in a position to move and turn and change the play calling, to complete the analogy, to suit the evidence that was coming in the courtroom. One of the skills that is very, very important for a trial attorney is to be a good listener.
Right.
Right? A lot of attorneys come into the courtroom, they know what they want to ask, and they're going to ask those questions regardless of what the witness says. But if you learn to become an even better listener than a questioner, certain gifts will appear.
Yeah.
So people say things, and you then follow up with questions. There were a number of instances of that. Two of them popped to mind. One of the officers who was particularly arrogant in the courtroom
One of the officers.
of the Salvation Army,
Okay.
kept talking about we. We looked at this, we did that, we considered this. And I asked, who is we? And he said, we are the officers in the upper command. So I said, so we did not include the men and women who worked day after day in the Salvation Army thrift store at 2040 Market Street, who worked under this looming wall that posed a great hazard to them. And he conceded that that's the case. The other great question and answer, one of the officers said, they try to derive a lot of currency from the fact that they are a religious institution, said that, I pray every day for the victims. And the question was asked, can you name the victims?
You asked that question?
I did not. All right? And there was a long, very awkward pause, at which point he conceded that he didn't know their names.
Plato Marinakis.
Yes.
You got a deal?
He was granted immunity in the criminal trial. So there was a criminal case being developed following grand jury indictment that tracked our civil case, but the criminal case went to trial first. Now, the excavator operator, Sean Benskop, pleaded guilty to manslaughter and aggravated assault, and he's currently serving 7 to 15 years in jail. Griffin Campbell, the demolition contractor, insisted on a trial. He was found guilty, and he's now serving 15 to 30 years in jail.
Wow.
By the way, our jury, if permitted by law, would have found them to have been 0% responsible. Unfortunately, in the criminal trial, their attorneys were not allowed to present testimony about the conduct of everybody else. In the civil trial, the jury understood very quickly that these two people were pawns of Mr. Basciano and STB Investments Corporation, and they were doing what they were told. So in order to prove their case, the DA no doubt worried that because of the Fifth Amendment right not to testify against yourself, that they wouldn't have adequate testimony to make their case against these two individuals. So they gave Plato Marinakis immunity so that he had no choice but to come in and testify. And based in part upon his testimony, Griffin Campbell was found guilty. I don't know whether the district attorney regrets that decision. I can only tell you that our jury found that Plato Marinakis engaged in reckless and outrageous conduct.
Steve, I'm going to quote from you here regarding Richard Basciano. Richard Basciano made a bet. He took a chance. He took a calculated and reckless and dangerous chance that he could demolish a building in Center City on one of the busiest thoroughfares using a cut-rate contractor who offered a bid less than 1/3 of his closest competitors. That was you.
That was part of one of the openings I gave, yeah.
It was the opening?
Yes.
Okay. Do you think he was the biggest, next to the Salvation Army, the biggest culprit?
Absolutely. He hired two inexperienced and incompetent contractors. One was Plato Marinakis, one was Griffin Campbell. This demolition became dangerous. This disaster became predictable the day that he hired these contractors. And he hired Griffin Campbell, the demolition contractor, who had never done any demolition remotely resembling what was required here, because his bid was 1/3 of the next lowest bid, 1/3. He wanted to do this on the cheap. But worse yet, when it became clear that he could not complete this project on time. He forced Griffin Campbell and Sean Benskop and Plato Marinakis to abandon what would have been a relatively safe demolition and force them to use a means and method of demolition that was tragically unsafe. They began tearing the building down with an excavator, which is not what you need to do. You need to take a building down, just like we know from playing with blocks as kids, from the top to the bottom, right? One floor at a time, by hand, because you can't scatter debris in a crowded urban area all around the building. Instead, they came in with an excavator, they ripped the front off, they left a freestanding wall, and unfortunately the rest is history.
Very sad. Did weed play a part in this too? That came out at a later date that they had been smoking marijuana or something.
No. Yes, Sean Benskop smoked marijuana that day. Sean Benskop was suffering from a debilitating disease where he had to generate an appetite to eat every day. And he could not afford medical marijuana. He smoked marijuana. There was absolutely no evidence that he was impaired. So,
what happened to Basciano?
Well, Mr. Basciano is now 92 years old. You mean what happened during the trial?
No, well, during the trial, yeah, whatever.
I mean, he's 92. Mr. Basciano and his company were found, I think, 15% responsible. It was difficult for him at trial. I had the privilege and task of cross-examining him. He yelled, he cried. There were a lot of histrionics. It could not have been easy for him to go through this trial, but frankly, quoting the old adage, you reap what you sow.
Yeah. What was it like for you to challenge with Richard Sprague, Jr.?
Well, it was actually Tom Sprague, his son, who was an outstanding attorney, and they had an outstanding staff. But Dick Sprague was very much a part of the trial. He did the closing argument, and it was an honor to be in a courtroom with one of the greatest trial lawyers in the history of our state. It really was. Well,
I think I'm in that company now with you. This was an incredible case. I never imagined any kind of, what kind of an award the jury would come back for the plaintiffs. I knew that they would come back with one. But as an attorney, a practicing attorney of 38 years, were you surprised with the award they came back with?
You know, it was, normally you hear, do you find such and such defendant negligent? And there's a pause, and then the answer is yes or no. Here, the court crier could barely get the words out of his mouth when the jury foreperson said yes. Do you find the Salvation Army to be negligent? Yes. Right? So that told me that they had long ago concluded individually, and then when they talked collectively, that the Salvation Army did not conduct itself appropriately, and they couldn't wait to tell us about that. So that was so the speed of their deliberations surprised me. The fact that they found against the Salvation Army, after I know they couldn't have deliberated for more than 25 or 30 minutes about their conduct in a 5.5-month trial, surprised me. What didn't surprise me is that they recognized the fact that the Salvation Army did not conduct itself in the way that it should have. A week into the damages case, they came to the table and settled the case. Well, there was arrogance, but again, they are one of America's most beloved charities. They are a church, with millions of adherents, right? And, for the most part, they do the most good. Not here. So they thought their status, I think, in society would carry the day.
Do you see changes in the L&I over this?
There are just numerous changes that I see in the greater Philadelphia area. Immediately after this disaster, the Department of Licenses and Inspections, at the order of the mayor, enacted new rules, basically closing a loophole for private demolitions and requiring that contractors demonstrate their qualifications, and also that there be a demolition plan and an engineering survey before work was done. Those things were not done in this case because the law did not require that they be done. I am hopeful that the Salvation Army makes changes in their infrastructure so that information that people in the field have can be communicated to upper command, and that they adopt a culture of communication and caring about what the people on the ground are experiencing. I do believe that Philadelphia is a safer city. I think after the verdict, I know this for a fact, property owners, developers, contractors, demolition contractors nationally, we're talking about this case. I think that people will be more careful in who they hire. I think that they will be vetting contractors who work in ways that could harm employees and the public. And that's one of the things that I feel the best about here. Because I think we have a safer city now that this case has been brought.
Well, it was an honor interviewing you. It was a real pleasure, and I enjoyed every minute of it. Thank you very much.
Good to
I
be
think you're
here.
a terrific lawyer, and I wish you the best going forward.
Thank you very much, John.